I was 18 at the time. I'd just graduated high school, and what was probably a really exciting and memorable time for most people was a stressful race against time for me. You see, my dad was very traditional. If I were going to be living in his house after high school, even just over the summer between graduation and college, I needed a job. If not, I was freeloaded, and he swore with an adamance I certainly didn't care to test that I'd be out on the street if I was unemployed for long. I'd had months of preparation. Hell, years, really. This entire time I could have been looking. He certainly hadn't waited until now to clue me in on the terms of living with him after high school. But I just wasn't the type to care that much about anything until I was days from a deadline. I just wasn't the type to care that much about anything until I was days from a deadline. Finding a job back then wasn't easy. I dyed my hair green, and my nose and lips were pierced, not to mention the gauges and the shitty stick-and-poke snake on my forearm that my 16-year-old self had afflicted upon me. Case in point, I wasn't getting hired most places. And being that I had about a week at the time left to figure it all out, like usual, I was in a mad scramble to line something up before facing the consequences. But then, as if some morbid miracle, a cop got shot and killed on 84th Avenue pretty close to the pass and go out there, and an opening for the night shift position appeared not long after. But he was gone by the time they understood the reason why, and they were left with no one to question them. The pass and go, and 84th Avenue as a whole, had a pretty bad reputation. See, 84th was one of the only roads in town still unpaved at parts, namely the north end shortly after the pass and go, and it wound along a pretty deep drainage ditch where no guardrails had ever been built, even after decades of complaints. There was a particularly tight bend up the road where a lot of drunk drivers and speeding teens learned that they were not in fact invincible, some of them even taking that lesson to the grave with them, and the lack of streetlights just made it all the more dangerous. But those were just the logical concerns. In a tiny town like mine, people are bored enough to run with sensational bullshit, and so 84th could never just be a dangerous road with poor construction and lack of safety measures to blame, but was instead cursed and haunted. People died there so often not because it was just a hazardous roadway, but because it was bloodthirsty, evil. People's reception when out on the road, not because it was essentially the furthest you could be from town, but because some malicious entity wanted you isolated. You get it. The woods beyond the ditch were even worse. On 3 occasions since the turn of the century, bodies were found out there, 1 a suicide, and 2 in shallow graves. And in a town as small as mine had been, that's a pretty sizable number. For a criminal, though, it only made sense to bury them there. Again, this place was basically abandoned and totally secluded. Really, the only other people that far northwest of town were the waggies at the pass and go, and they weren't getting paid enough to be on the lookout for anything. Not to mention they had their own weirdness to deal with. All sorts of strange and illegal activities happened in that pothole-ridden parking lot, and why wouldn't it? That place was the last beacon of humanity's presence in the town for miles, until you got to 90th Street, the main road shooting off from the highway. So anybody working there had enough going on at their own doorstep and wouldn't be paying any attention to cars pulled off on the side of the road with mysteriously heavy duffel bags in the trunk. Suffice it to say, once the position opened, I was the only person in town out of options enough to drop off an application. And wouldn't you know it, I was scheduled to start 2 days later. I picked it up quick. The job was easy, and though at first I was shadowing a guy that, by all accounts, could have been undead, I was left to my own devices a week later. To be honest, I actually kind of liked the job at first. 10 p.m. to 6 a.m. were pretty standard hours of consciousness for me anyway, and working the graveyard shift finally gave me an excuse to sleep in until 3. It was dead most nights. Sometimes, and I'm not exaggerating, I literally didn't see a single customer. And other nights, the goofiness of my interactions with various druggies kept things interesting. But those kinds of nights aren't what this story is about. The first time I remember being pretty confused was only 2 weeks after I'd started the job. It was the day I arrived at the jail. I was pretty stoned at the time, so I tensed up when I saw a cop walking toward the door, but I wasn't complacent enough to blaze it before work without eye drops, for fear of these exact situations. Not so much worried about getting arrested, but about what my dad would do to me. I also had a little bit of a heads up in the form of a faulty open sign in the window. The neon would pretty often flicker or dim for some reason when people were coming up to the door. Really couldn't tell you why it happened, but when I was totally fucking off behind the counter, it was my cue to act natural for a minute. And since a bunch of random bullshit was stacked up on the side of the counter to my left facing the parking lot and the pumps, I couldn't ever see out the windows unless I was actively looking over it, so, needless to say, whatever was wrong with that sign certainly wasn't something I was going to try and get fixed. When the cop walked in, I sort of leaned back as casually as possible and tried to make small talk with him so his mind wouldn't wander anywhere else. "See any crazies?" I inquired. "Not yet," he answered, perusing the energy drinks like a selection of fine wines. He sounded pretty bored, and I hoped that that wasn't an indication that he was looking for something to do. "Well, lucky you," I chuckled. "Can't say the same myself." "Yeah." He settled on a sugar-fry monster. He walked over to the counter, and I remember thinking he was either a new guy or one of those officers that just never stop being motivated, going off his short hair and fresh fade. Though judging off how young he looked, definitely early 20s, I was going with the former. These were the worst types of cops from my experience. They're always looking for a way to stand out to their higher-ups. "Nah," I continued. "Saw a lady sleeping in a shopping cart out back. Asked her why the shopping cart, and she said she learned from a TV show that you should never sleep on the bare ground. You learn something new every day," I smirked. "Cool," she said. "That actually happened last week, but who's counting?" He actually smiled slightly. "Weirdos, man." "Yeah." "Will that be all?" "Yeah. $3.29. He tapped his card on the reader, and while the sale processed, I remember actually feeling slightly concerned for the guy. I wasn't a big fan of cops, but one of them had died around here recently after all, and just talking with this guy face to face sort of humanized him to me. As he cupped the top of the drink and slid it off the counter, I said, "Stay safe out there." He glanced at me and raised an eyebrow. "You know something I don't?" "Nah, that cop that got shot out here a couple weeks ago." I just stared at him. "Listen," he peered at my name tag for a second. "Carter, you can't believe everything you hear about this place. 84th Avenue, it's just a street, man. Most of what you hear about this place is embellished or even totally made up." Yeah, all right." "Well, have a good night, officer." I paused, squinting at his name tag back. "Brady." He walked off into the night, his energy drink in his hand. At the time, I didn't give that interaction a whole lot of thought. I learned most of my news from memes, and it was definitely possible I'd been wrong. Unlikely, but possible. But over time, stranger things began to occur, and I'm not talking about druggies sleeping in shopping carts. I began to pick up on an anomaly with the neon sign. See, it actually didn't flicker very often. It seemed to at first, but after getting caught off guard multiple times by random people coming in, I realized I couldn't trust it as much as I thought I could. Yet strangely, though it seemed inconsistent, I realized it always blinked and dimmed for certain people. There was this lady that would come in about once a week and buy a scratch-off ticket. I figured she had to be pretty depressed, 'cause she was always wearing the same clothes and was coming to this dingy-ass place with relative frequency. Every time she'd ask for the same ticket, Cash Kaiser, and every time I'd slide it to her, she'd smile at me and say, "Maybe tonight's the night." Even in her voice, I could hear how much she needed a break, but I guess tonight was never the night. 'cause a week or two later, she'd always be back, always dressed the same, always buying a colorful strip of false hope that things would suddenly change for her. I tried to chat with her the more she came in, but she wasn't keen on giving away details about her life. She was mostly unresponsive, just nodding or giving me one-word answers, and then she'd head out in kind of a hurry. But her clothes weren't the only thing that stayed the same every time. Every single time she came into the pass and go, that sign would flicker. Now, I could have just been reading into things too much. I wondered if the sign was ultimately connected to a wire through the ground maybe, and maybe certain people were stepping over it, and those people just kind of came in the same way every time. I didn't really know. I'm not an electrician. But the sort of Groundhog Day that transpired every time she stopped by really did intrigue me. Then, one night in early July, I had another curious experience. I was listening to some podcast about ayahuasca and contemplating if I'd ever take the plunge when the green flicker of my inconsistent early morning system caught my attention. And when my eyes trailed from the neon sign and over the merchandise on the counter to the pumps out in the dark beyond, I saw a guy pumping gas into his truck, probably in his mid-30s. He had this really gruff look on his face, but I wouldn't have paid it much mind except for the fact someone was with him, a girl about my age. While he was by the pump, she was heading into the store. She had black hair down to about her shoulders and these big brown eyes. Her skin was kind of pale, like she probably didn't get out much, and she wore skinny jeans and a gray top. As soon as I noticed her approaching, I stepped back from the window. I definitely didn't want to creep her out by being seen peeking over the counter through the glass. She came in, and as the chime above the door rang, I couldn't help but glance at her as she beelined to the snacks. She was cute, and I was considering flirting with her at first, but then I glanced over the counter again at the guy in the parking lot, presuming him to be her big brother or dad or something. I didn't want to piss him off, so I decided to keep it casual. She was over by the coolers on the back wall the next time I found her, not looking my direction while she scanned our selection of sports drinks. Then she grabbed a red Gatorade and came walking up to the front. She put the drink and a bag of classic Lay's on the counter, and when I noticed it was almost 4 a.m, I couldn't help but inquire, "What's got you out so late?" I was scanning the items with muscle memory, my eyes meeting hers after she glanced at the counter for a second, as if considering a response. "Nothing, really. Big bro?" I flicked my eyes to the guy in the parking lot, and at this her nose wrinkled. "No." I thought that was a strange response. "You?" I asked as the total popped up on the screen. "It's gross to have a brother?" "It's gross to kiss your brother," she smiled flatly. And I didn't want to seem creepy, but I couldn't help but get on the tip of my toes for a second and peek at him again. No doubt the guy was in his 30s, and if I had to be more specific, I'd be leaning more toward late 30s than early. He was wearing boots, jeans, and a blue and brown flannel, and had a 5 o'clock shadow I could see from the store. The more I looked at him, the more weirded out I felt. But then again, none of this was my business, and I didn't want to pry. She definitely didn't seem to be with him against her will, and maybe in life he would have. But his fateful march to the street where his life would be taken from him seemed programmed to resume as he suddenly turned and walked out the door, just like he had the last time, back in June, taking his energy drink with him. I followed him outside, standing beneath the fluctuating sign as my eyes fell onto the exit wounds in his back, the red streaks oozing from the holes in his uniform. I felt like I could cry at the sight of it. I walked back inside and had made my mind up to quit then and there. I wrote up a note and left it in the manager's office. Then I locked the place up and left the key under the propane cylinder exchange out front, about to text my morning relief where the key was, when I froze. I remembered the girl with black hair and big brown eyes. The neon sign that I had once thought of as my early warning customer alert, and now understood to be some kind of paranormal detection radar, had flickered with her entrance too, just like it had for the biker, and the scratch-off lady, and Officer Brady. In that moment, I became weirdly consumed with this desire to know what had happened to her. Maybe it was because I found her cute, or maybe it was because even in the moment that night, something felt horribly off. But for some reason or another, I became totally invested in figuring out what had happened to her, to the point that I decided to unlock the store and stick around. I went back to the computer, but for some reason, though I was able to find information about other people that had died in the area, some of whom I'd even seen walk into this gas station's very doors in the middle of the night, I was completely unable to find her, and it really ate at me. I went back to the front at some point around 5 a.m., but still, I was just searching on my phone for the girl, though by the time my relief came in at 6 a.m., I still hadn't found shit. And that was my obsession for the next couple days. When I'd exhausted every article about deaths on 84th, I began to wonder if anyone even knew she was dead. So I searched local missing persons, and I looked into all of them, but still, none of them were this girl. It haunted me for days. I began reliving as much of that night as I could, trying to recall every single detail. I could remember her hinting that the guy she was with was her boyfriend, which even then was a red flag, but now, as I remembered that older guy in the parking lot pumping gas in the dark, it filled me with dread. I didn't get that good of a look at him. I could tell he had some stubble and was wearing a flannel, jeans, and boots, but what good was that? As for his truck, I wasn't sure exactly what make or model it was, just that it was red and looked old. I could only assume the punched-out glass was like the biker's motorcycle, something that had taken place after the girl's death, or more likely, during. And I remembered her asking me if I had ever done something crazy and overnight. And as I mulled over the words for hours, sitting on the back porch smoking a bowl as the sun set before my shift, I ruminated on all the possibilities such a vague statement could mean. But then, when I remembered her saying she was on something like a road trip, it started to click. This creates contrast with the voice in my head. The guy she was with, her boyfriend, must have been taking her off somewhere, probably far from her home. Maybe they'd been talking online, probably in secret, 'cause no parent would let their kid date a grown-ass man like that, and she seemed to be about 18, like myself. Maybe he'd driven to where she lived, and this big, crazy overnight decision she made was climbing into this stranger's vehicle that she'd been tricked into thinking was safe, driving with him for God knows how long as he took her to God knows where. And then they stopped at the Pass and Go on 84th Avenue for gas. At first, that part didn't make sense to me. Yet this place was a couple miles south of 90th Street, which came right off the highway, but why wouldn't he stop for gas at one of the many gas stations out there closer to the interstate? Though, the more I thought about it, the more I started to piece it together. If this guy really was from out of state and was trying to get her back to his place undetected, it made sense he didn't pull right off the highway to the nearest gas station where cops could be combing through camera footage. Instead, he drove off to the most secluded road in the whole town, 84th Avenue. After the observation was finished, the team filled in the perimeter, upper and lower lizards, presumably with a special designation for this particular road, in the whole town. 84th Avenue. I started to feel overwhelmed. I had nothing to go off of to narrow my search, really, and for all I knew, I'd have to look at missing persons listings for people in every surrounding state, and maybe even farther than that. I mean, that was just impossible. But at last, saying a prayer to whoever was listening, I typed in the vaguest string of clues I had. Missing girl, brown eyes, black hair, red truck. And then I scrolled and scrolled and scrolled. I searched at first in various counties in Iowa. Maybe she was just from a lower part of the state. But when that didn't yield anything, I searched the same sentence with counties in Missouri at the end, and then Kansas, and then Nebraska. And then, after over an hour of looking, my heart skipped a beat. I saw those big brown eyes looking back at me through my cell phone screen. I clicked on the news article, and there, in her missing persons listing, was unmistakably the girl's face, just like the one in the gas station. I immediately read the article, like it was some sort of divine revelation. Her name was Amber Wicker. She would have just turned 18. In fact, her birthday was only 2 months ago, but her disappearance was 4 months ago, which meant that on the night that she'd actually stepped into the gas station, and not the memory I had cohabitated, she was only 17, making the whole thing even more disturbing to me. She was last seen on her front door's Ring camera climbing into a red truck parked across the street, almost totally out of frame, but even in the glimpse of it available in the video, I could tell it was the same one when I saw the 2x4s and blue tarp. My stomach sank as I watched Amber hurry down the driveway, looking once over her shoulder to the safety of the house she was abandoning, then reaching the truck and climbing into the passenger's seat before it took off up the road. I leaned back in the chair, letting out a beleaguered sigh. So Amber Wicker was her name, and as far as the police knew, she was missing. But I knew she was dead. After all, every customer that had walked in beneath the flickering sign had been a corpse, and as much as I wanted to believe otherwise, I assumed her case wasn't any different. So as much as I wanted to stop working at that place, as much as it bothered me to see those ghosts walking the fated paths of their memories through the purgatory that was the pass and go off 84th Avenue, I had to stay. I had to wait until Amber came back so I could gather enough evidence to give to police. After all, though some of the dead only came in once, like the biker, others had come in twice, like Officer Brady, and even others had come in on almost a weekly basis, like the scratch-off lady. Eventually, I hoped she would come back. And so the rest of July, I picked up more night shifts, desperately wanting to be there the night she hopefully returned. I also chatted with Justin, the guy who I'd shadowed and who worked nights when I was off, but his brain seemed constantly fried on something, and if he'd had any paranormal experiences, he hadn't noticed. I asked him about the sign flickering, and he said it did that on occasion, so I knew he'd seen at least some ghosts. But when I asked him about Amber, he wasn't sure if he'd seen her or not. Needless to say, I wasn't getting anything useful out of him. I asked him to just keep his eyes open for her, and if he saw her, to note the license plate of the truck by the pump. You'd think such a strange request would raise an eyebrow, but he was so zombified on whatever the hell it was he was abusing in his off time that he just said, sure. In the weeks after I'd pinned down Amber's true identity, I began to research her a bit. I could only find 2 articles about her. One was the one I first found, which just had the basic details of her disappearance, and the other was an even smaller article in which her parents had given a statement and a number to call if anyone knew anything. I really wanted to call that number, but I knew that right now I honestly didn't have shit. I could always say I was at the gas station that night and saw something, but the security camera footage only went back 60 days, so there'd be no proof one way or the other. I didn't have a license plate, and I was a whole state over. I didn't have a lot of faith the police would be able to do much with that, and I didn't want to give her parents false hope. So I decided I'd just wait until her memory replayed again, and I could piece together some actionable details. In the meantime, the more I searched her, I was at last able to find some of her socials, but her Instagram was private, and her Twitter was inactive for years. At last I knew where to find her and her Twitter accounts. I spent hours trying to figure out how to reach her, though when I stumbled upon her Facebook, even though it too hadn't had a post uploaded in 2 years, I felt strangely more connected to her as I scrolled through her photos, this immortal anthology of a dead girl's time on Earth, floating in cyberspace for anyone to find, and sharing her memories from before her life was prematurely snuffed out. I found pictures of her laughing with her friends, smiling at a dance, blowing out birthday candles. I saw random posts ranging from her excitedly proclaiming she'd gotten her learner's permit to complaining about failing some biology test. All these moments of this girl's life, both significant and insignificant, were here forever, memories accessible to anyone that cared to find them. And really, her appearance at the gas station wasn't much different. Though that memory was supernatural, unfolding in real time over a real place, it was in essence the same, just some moment of her existence that unaffiliated people such as myself were able to witness. Return-wise, I studied the mirror, my fingers closing over hers at the base of the window, though whether or not I had been the one to see it for a reason, or my witnessing of it was just as inconsequential and random as me scrolling through her Facebook page, I felt that I was a part of this girl's story now, and it was my duty to help her however I could. But by August, she still hadn't come back. And strangely, neither had Officer Brady, or the biker, or even the scratch-off lady. There was only one other occurrence of the sign flickering, and I guess it was either a no-show ghost or a fuck you from the universe, 'cause no one ended up coming in, but worried that whatever supernatural phenomenon had been taking place was over just as suddenly as it had begun, and that I'd never see her again, never be given a chance to atone for my apathetic complacency that night when I could have paid more attention to a situation that was obviously suspicious. And even worse, I was shipping off to college in just a couple of weeks. My remaining days at the pass and go were numbered. So, on August 3rd, while sitting behind the counter in the dead of night, waiting for the purgatorial replay of an apparition's final stop on the drive to her untimely death, I made up my mind. If she didn't come in tonight, then tomorrow I'd take matters into my own hands. It would be proper for me, too, to die in excellent style. It dawned on me that Ember must have died nearby here. The only ghosts that ever walked into this gas station were those that had died on 84th Avenue, and that was true for Officer Brady, who had been shot just down the road, the biker who had crashed into the canal by the bend, the scratch-off lady who had hanged herself in the woods, and all the others I'd seen walk through those doors beneath the flickering green glow. And though I had no idea where to look, I had one thing to go off of. I'd seen the truck turn right at the turnoff. So somewhere north of here, she must have died. And maybe, just maybe, I could figure out where. By morning, I still hadn't seen her, or any ghost for that matter, and after chatting with Tegan, my morning relief, I walked out to my car. But though I'd planned on driving home and getting some sleep, then searching later, I just couldn't resist the urge to look right then and there. I sat there at the desk for a moment, shaking. Was I hallucinating? I'd heard you can get permanent schizophrenia-like psychosis from psilocybin, but this was the first and only time I'd ever hallucinated when not on the shit. And as I just stared at the monitor unblinkingly, shaking in place, I really couldn't tell what was more horrific. If I hadn't really seen that, or if I had, but then my eyes grabbed it to the one part of my memory that was corroborated by the cameras. The neon. It was dim, and as I unpaused the video, I watched it continue to flicker all the way until my eyes turned to the end of 84th that I could see, and as soon as they did, it shined like normal again. I rewound the footage again, and sure enough, as soon as I began to react to the phantom motorcycle, the sign started flickering. It flickered the whole time, throughout that whole interaction, until the biker was gone. So I wasn't crazy. Something suggested there was more going on than me just losing my shit. Videm, what the hell had just happened? I didn't even go back to the front as I began racking my mind for all the other times the sign had flickered, and instantly I recalled the scratch-off lady. I quickly Googled 84th Avenue deaths, thinking that maybe I could identify some of these people, but the first thing that came up was the police officer shooting. Then my jaw dropped as I stared into the memorialized eyes of Officer Brady. I could barely sit still as his eyes looked back at me from the computer screen, the same officer I had spoken to just a month ago who didn't know about any officer shootings in the area. Because he was the officer that would be shot. I kept looking, and before long I found the scratch-off lady. She was some lonely divorced woman that committed suicide in the woods a couple miles north of here in 2011. and the biker had crashed into the ditch right off the bend 3 years ago, one of many drunk drivers that didn't react to the turn in time and went face hurtle into the canal.